It's nice to be here. I've been on strike most of the last couple of weeks. So if you haven't already gone down to a higher education institution to give your support, please do so. And that is also an excuse for being a bit rushed in putting this together. But nonetheless, I want to start by asking you to imagine an elite higher education institution. So picture it in your head. What does it look like? It's a university with a long reputation, maybe an international reputation, research excellence, and all the rest of it. Most likely you thought of somewhere that looks a bit like this. That's the Bodleian Library in Oxford and Balliol College, where our Prime Minister went. Oxford and Cambridge together educate about 1% of English school students that go on to university. So a tiny percentage of the overall student body and the overall age cohort, an even smaller percentage of that. And yet, Oxford and Cambridge in 2018 had a combined financial endowment, so that just means the investments, the properties, shares they hold that creates interest, which then funds these institutions, of £21 billion, which is vastly more than any other education institution in the UK. Not as much as those in the States, but pretty big for the UK. And this money that sustains and creates an elite educational institution, not just higher education institutions, but also the elite schools, private schools in particular, which I'm going to talk about a bit more. This money doesn't come from nowhere. And what we need to do when we think about the inequalities in our education system is think about where the money's coming from. Money finds a way is perhaps the kind of other subtitle to this talk. There's a long history of dirty money in education. And in Oxford, they've recently accepted a £150 million donation from Stephen Schwarzman for a new Centre for the Humanities. You know, you might think, great, humanities are under attack at the moment, history, the arts, they need the money. But this money, Stephen Schwarzman works for Blackstone Group, which is a big American investment firm. And there's a group of staff at the University of Oxford who have formed a campaign to argue that the university shouldn't have accepted this donation, because Blackstone Group is invested in the deforestation of the Amazon, it's invested in companies that have caused the global housing crisis, and a bit closer to home, they're invested in private companies that do NHS services, that are paid for NHS services but don't pay any tax on the profits that they make. So there's the Oxford Against Schwarzman campaign. There is a long history of this kind of philanthropic donation to elite educational institutions, which we need to think about whenever we see kind of educational prestige, and whenever we kind of make that assumption that what we're looking at is just created through excellent teaching, excellent research, whatever that may mean. And this is also true when we think about private schools. So this is Colston School in Bristol, and Colston School was named after Edward Colston, who's up here. And he was a slaver. He was a slave trader. And a lot of the money that founded Bristol's private schools, there are three which have kind of links to the slave trade. It comes from the profits of slavery. And there's another private school in Scotland, which is pictured here, Dollar Academy, which has the same story. Now, for a lot of elite educational institutions, their finances are a bit more difficult to pick apart. It's difficult to look at where exactly the money came from that founded these institutions that either were from the beginning or later became institutions for the elite and for the middle class. And there are kind of a few other examples that I'll mention briefly. Places like St. Paul's in London, St. Paul's Boys' School, which was funded by land in the East End of London. In Stepney, working class rents, working class neighbourhood, were funding a private school in the West End until the land was compulsory purchased by the Labour government, but I won't go into too much detail. The other and the biggest and wealthiest educational institution in the UK is Trinity College, Cambridge, which is one of the colleges that make up the University of Cambridge. Now, if you've ever been to the Millennium Dome, not the Doncaster Dome, I nearly said that. I used to go swimming there. The Millennium Dome, then you've inadvertently funded Trinity College because they own the land on which it sits. The company that the Millennium Dome belongs to pays rent to Trinity College. They also own the Port of Felixstowe. They have shares in arms companies, and they also perhaps worst of all, own shares in Arcos, which is the company that put the cladding on the Grenfell Tower. So when we look at elite educational institutions, when you see Trinity College, what I want you to think is not, that's a pretty building. What I want you to ask is, where did the money come from to build this? What is behind that nice stone facade? Because more often than not, what you find is that what is behind that stone is flesh, it's people who were exploited, and it's their stories that are not told, but it's their stories that provide the profits and continue to provide the profits that allow elite education to be possible in this country and internationally. Even if these investments were somehow ethical, we still have the basic problem of inequality. So this is Eton's endowment, which has increased year on year. So in the endowment, again, it's just the property they own, the investments, the stocks and shares. Now, if you look at Eton's income in 2017-18, it was £72 million. That works out as £55,800 per student. Now, compare that to local state schools in Windsor and Maidenhead. They have a per-student income in the same year of £5,000. And you still have this kind of, even if those investments were ethical, and I don't think it would really be possible, but even if they were ethical, you'd still have this basic problem of inequality. Are some children worth 10 times more than others? Not all private schools are as wealthy as Eton, but still in Newcastle, if you were talking about the difference between the Royal Grammar School and the other state schools in this city, then you'd still be talking about the school having 2 or 3 times more income than most state schools. So what we did last year, and the kind of task that remains and that is still there, despite the fact that in these times when we have a resurgence of right-wing nationalism, we have a billionaire in the White House and our 20th Etonian Prime Minister, there is still the need to keep the ideas alive and to keep the knowledge alive of how inequality in our education system is produced and how inequality in our society is maintained. And what we did, me and 3 other school teachers, brilliant school teachers, last year we formed the Labour Campaign Against Private School, or Abolish Eton, which was a campaign to integrate private schools into the state sector and to change Labour Party policy. And we did that, and it was the first time in 40 years that the Labour Party conference that talked about this at its conference. So Labour Party policy is, in theory, to bring private schools back into the state sector. We're a long way away from that with the general election result. But however far we are away from it, the task that still falls on us is to keep the ideas of what an alternative system of education could look like, and also to remember how these inequalities are produced. And that means doing the local work of raising political consciousness about educational inequality, how it's produced at a local level, and I'm sure there are many of you in this room that know and have first-hand experience of it, either as students or teachers or both. That means also contesting and rethinking the way that educational inequality is understood and how it's framed in this country. We've had the Social Mobility Commission for 10 years in the UK. And the Social Mobility Commission is obsessed with fair access to elite jobs and elite universities. And fair enough, you might think. But this commission has never asked whether those elite institutions or those elite careers are a good idea in the first place. Not once has it asked that. And if we only think about things in terms of access to these elite institutions, then the question of the existence of these elite institutions in the first place is a question that we never ask. And access matters, of course it matters. It's vital. I work at Durham University, and Durham University needs to change. And there are moves now to try and improve access for working class and ethnic minority students to Durham. There are ambitious targets, and that's a good thing. But if we only think about access, we narrow the way that we think about educational inequality in this country. it becomes very difficult then to talk about institutional inequality, and it becomes very difficult to put into question whether, in fact, a system which is based on the concentration of wealth into a very small number of institutions, in fact, makes any sense whatsoever. It also leads to the potential for unintended consequences. So this is Durham, this is Castle College, and Sunderland University, which I'm sure people in the room will be familiar with, and familiar perhaps with this story, which is that they're facing cuts in their politics and languages departments. Now, Durham, in 2018-19, took 5.5% of its students from low higher education participation neighbourhoods, right? Sunderland took nearly 30%. And if we think about where access happens, it is not in elite institutions like Durham, though they may need to change, and they should change. It's in places like this. It's in further education colleges. It's in post-92 universities, comprehensives, that have fought against the grain of government policy, which is obsessed with access to elite institutions. But if we, in seeking to broaden access to somewhere like Durham or Oxford or Cambridge, in the context of the Northeast, if we lower the offers to get into Durham, which is something that is on the table and which should happen, there is the risk that we then effectively steal students that would have gone to Sunderland or Teesside or Northumbria. And that, for me, is the last thing that I think we should be doing. So there are these real contradictions that are not resolvable within the current kind of discourse and way that educational inequality is understood in this country. And I wanted to talk about the problem of access and mention a local writer who some of you might be familiar with, Jack Common, who was a working class writer from Heaton. He said that always the pride that prevailed in this working class school, and he's talking about going to school in the 20s, was that it succeeded in turning out less recruits for the working class than any other of its kind in the district. That less was still the majority, mind you. A great crowd that stayed on for 2 or 3 years after the scholarship culling was over, but what they were celebrating was always the minority that went on to, in this case, grammar schools, and perhaps on to higher education after that. And now it may not be that we're celebrating the students that go on to grammar school, but if you look at most school websites, its success in getting into the Russell Group and to Oxbridge and to dentistry and medicine courses, and for most state schools in the UK, that will only ever be a minority. Because we have never had in this country an educational system that truly serves the majority of people. Whether it's the exam system or the financial inequalities that I've talked about here, we've always had a system that protects and serves the few, not the many. What we need to do is to keep the ideas alive that will allow us to kind of build alternative futures for higher education and for education more broadly. And we're surrounded constantly by paths not taken. This is an example towards the comprehensive university, which was an argument by Robin Pedley that we should extend comprehensive school reform into post-16, into higher education. And these ideas are still alive. And they're still alive in books like this from colleagues at Bristol and in reports like this that we put together for class. And the kind of the whispers and the phantoms that haunt the elite educational institutions, these ideas of alternative systems, they're still there. And they're still there even within the bastions of privilege, because there are those of us who would build this world anew, even if that means pulling down the pillars of privilege that have sustained us and benefited us. Thanks very much.